indications that loyalist paramilitaries have started to decommission their weapons. It's believed the government in Northern Ireland has been given full details of the historic move by the head of the Independent International Commission on Decommissioning, General John de Chastelin. The Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, and the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA, have been under pressure for some time to abandon their guns, following the IRA's decision to dispose of its weapons 4 years ago. Our Ireland correspondent, Mark Simpson, has this report.
During 30 years of violence, loyalist paramilitaries killed almost 1,000 people, mostly Catholics. Even after they called a ceasefire, they kept their guns. And at least once a year, they fired them in the air in front of their hardline supporters. It's believed that the two largest groups, the UVF and UDA, built up a stockpile of around 900 weapons. Reports today suggest the UDA is on the verge of decommissioning some of its guns, and the UVF has already started. Northern Ireland's Secretary of State Sean Woodward said the importance of such a move should not be underestimated.
If this act has indeed taken place, no one should lose its significance, and I do not think on the streets of Belfast and across Northern Ireland the significance will be lost.
Sir Hugh Ord, Northern Ireland's Chief Constable, said the security threat from loyalists was now greatly reduced.
They always were a threat. In terms of how much of a threat, I'm far more concerned about distant Republican terrorists. But nonetheless, more guns are off the street as a result of this decision by both the UDA, as I understand it, and the UVF.
Confirmation is expected to come soon from the loyalist groups themselves. Once the IRA started decommissioning, they ended up getting rid of all of their weapons. Loyalists will be expected to do the same.
A journalist in Northern Ireland has won the right to withhold from the police records of her dealings with a dissident Republican group responsible for murdering 2 soldiers. A judge in Belfast said the life of Suzanne Breen, who works for the Dublin-based Sunday Tribune newspaper, would be at risk if she disclosed the information. The police service of Northern Ireland said it would accept the court's decision. From Belfast, our correspondent Jane Peel reports.
The police wanted Suzanne Breen to hand over her mobile phone, computer and notes to help their investigation into the murders of 2 young soldiers at a barracks in Antrim in March. Ms. Breen had taken the call from the real IRA, which admitted responsibility for the attack. She refused to give the police the material, saying it would breach her journalistic duty of confidentiality and put her life at risk. Ruling in her favour, the Belfast recorder, Judge Burgess, said he had to balance 2 competing interests: the investigation of the most serious of crimes and the coveted right of an individual to life. But he said the real IRA was a ruthless and murderous group which would regard the journalist as a legitimate target should she disclose any information. The threat to her and potentially her partner and 14-year-old child could last for years. Suzanne Breen called it a landmark decision.
The past few months have been obviously very stressful. I think this action by police should never have been taken. I think it was a complete waste of time, resources and of taxpayers' money, and hopefully the police will learn from this decision and no other journalists will find themselves in the position that I found myself, potentially facing up to 5 years in prison for doing nothing other than my job.
The police service of Northern Ireland said it accepted the court's decision but would continue to use every legal means to get hold of information to help the investigation. A spokesman said the victims, their families and the community expected and deserved nothing less.
Government borrowing leapt last month, raising fears that the total for the year could exceed the amount forecast by the
forecast. The northeast could suffer more winter flooding. The southwest might get more tourists. For the first time, the Met Office have projected the future in 25-kilometre squares. Professor 2100.
Would I prepare, not only for the central estimate, what would I have to do for this 10% estimate?
Computer models.
There are things we know from the basic
computer models.
There are things we know.
Computer models.
There are things we know from the basic climate science, which aren't currently reflected in our global climate models. These can have very large economic and social consequences, and the projections will not reflect those events.
The government says it's that very uncertainty that makes action to reduce greenhouse gases essential. One thing is for sure, the UK's geography will... Computer models.
There are things we know from the basic climate science which aren't currently reflected in our global climate models. These can have very large economic and social consequences, and the projections will not reflect those events.
The government says it's that very uncertainty that makes action to reduce greenhouse gases essential. One thing is for sure, the UK's geography will protect it from the worst of climate change. That will be visited on the poorest countries which can afford it least.
Lady Thatcher is to have surgery on her upper arm.
In our global climate models. These can have very large economic and social consequences, and the projections will not reflect those events.
The government says it's that very uncertainty that makes action to reduce greenhouse gases essential. One thing is for sure, the UK's geography will protect it from the worst of climate change. That will be visited on the poorest countries which can afford it least.
Lady Thatcher is to have surgery on her upper arm tomorrow after fracturing it in a fall.
Computer models.
There are things we know from the basic climate science which aren't currently reflected in our global climate models. These can have very large economic and social consequences, and the projections will not reflect those events.
The government says it's that very uncertainty that...
Things we know from the basic climate science which aren't currently reflected in our global climate models. These can have very large economic and social consequences,